If you want to understand World War II beyond battle maps and famous generals, you have to step into the kitchens, backyards and ration queues of ordinary civilians. Food rationing was not a side note of the war. It was a daily pressure that shaped habits, relationships, health and survival itself. For millions, the real front line was the dinner table. What's often misunderstood is that people did not simply endure rationing passively. They adapted engineered systems, bent rules, revived old skills, and in many cases completely rewired how they thought about food. That's what we're digging into today, not slogans or nostalgia, but how civilians actually survived when calories, protein, fat and sugar were suddenly controlled by the state, and scarcity was permanent. Why food rationing became a daily survival problem rather than a temporary inconvenience. By 1940, rationing was not about fairness alone. It was about survival of the nation-state. Britain imported more than half its food before the war, and German U-boats made those supply lines lethal. In occupied Europe, agricultural output collapsed under requisitions and destroyed infrastructure. In the United States, rationing came later and was less severe, but even there it reshaped consumption. Civilians quickly realized this was not a short-term disruption. Once that reality set in, survival depended on strategy rather than patience. People stopped thinking in terms of meals and started thinking in terms of nutrients, shelf life, and, well, substitution. Calories became currency. Fats were guarded like gold. Sugar wasn't just for taste. It was energy, morale, and, even barter. This mental shift is the first lesson modern survivalists often miss. The civilians who did best were those who accepted the long haul early and adjusted immediately, rather than waiting for normal to return. How ration books worked in theory, and why survival depended on what happened outside the system. Ration books were designed to guarantee a baseline, not comfort. In Britain, weekly rations of meat, butter, bacon, sugar and eggs were tightly controlled, while bread was initially unrationed to avoid unrest. On paper, everyone got enough to survive. But, in reality, availability fluctuated, quality varied, and certain foods simply vanished. The ration system only worked if you understood its gaps. Civilians learned quickly that rationing did not limit consumption, it limited access. If you could produce food yourself, trade legally or illegally, or stretch ingredients creatively, you could eat far better than the ration scale suggested. This is where survival became unequal, not by class alone, but by knowledge, adaptability, and social networks. So, here's the thing. Home production really became the backbone of civilian survival. Victory gardens, they weren't just patriotic decoration. They were actual survival infrastructure. In Britain, the Dig for Victory campaign meant lawns, parks and even sports fields got turned into food-producing land. Potatoes, cabbage, carrots and onions. Those were the main ones because, they were calorie-dense, reliable and stored well. Families tracked planting cycles with a sort of military discipline, staggering harvests to avoid waste. Now, the key detail that's often overlooked is civilians prioritised crops that replaced rationed foods nutritionally, not culturally. Potatoes took the place of bread. Leafy greens made up for scarce vitamins. And root vegetables, well, they replaced bulk. Right. So, modern application is, well, pretty straightforward. If you're planning for food insecurity, you really ought to grow what sustains you, not just what entertains you. Calories, storage and reliability, those matter a whole lot more than taste. Now, let's talk about how cooking methods changed to stretch every gram of food. During the war, kitchens really became laboratories of efficiency. Roasting, you see, wasted fat, so boiling and stewing took over as the dominant ways of cooking. Meat was minced, diluted and extended with things like oats, breadcrumbs or vegetables. Bones, well, they were never discarded. They'd be boiled again and again for stock until they gave up nothing more. And leftovers, they weren't just meals. They were ingredients, really. British housewives were taught to reuse cooking water from vegetables to retain nutrients. Drippings were collected, clarified and reused. Even stale bread became puddings or thickening agents. The lesson here is that survival cooking is not about recipes, it's about process. If you can extract maximum nutrition from minimal input, you can survive prolonged scarcity. How black markets and informal trade quietly kept people alive. Official histories like to downplay it, but black markets were essential. In occupied Europe especially, survival often depended on illegal trade. Farmers swapped eggs for soap. Urban families traded clothing for potatoes. Barter networks, you know, replaced currency as inflation and scarcity destroyed purchasing power. The key factor was trust. People relied on repeated relationships, not anonymous exchange. Today's parallel, really, is local networks. In any prolonged crisis, survival improves dramatically if you are embedded in a community where skills and resources can be exchanged quietly and reliably. You know, it's quite fascinating how psychology and routine actually prevented starvation, not by abundance, but really through discipline. One of the most underrated survival tools back then was, well, routine. Civilians ate at fixed times, their portions were strictly measured, and they avoided any sort of impulsive consumption. Treats, they were saved for morale, not just to satisfy hunger. Children, they were taught from an early age to accept smaller portions as completely normal. This kind of psychological adaptation, it really helped prevent those binge and bust cycles that could lead to rapid depletion. For modern survival planning, this matters. Food discipline preserves resources far more effectively than stockpiles alone. Rationing works best when it becomes habit, not punishment. How these lessons apply directly to modern preparedness. World War II civilians survived because they combined production, substitution, efficiency, community and discipline into a single system. You can apply this today by learning calorie math, growing storage crops, mastering low-waste cooking, and building trust-based exchange networks. None of this requires collapse to practice. The earlier these habits form, the easier they function. under pressure. World War II food rationing was not just endured, it was mastered by those willing to adapt. And that's the real lesson worth carrying forward. If this kind of grounded, no-nonsense history matters to you, subscribe to Iron Age Instincts, share this with someone who studies survival seriously, and keep this knowledge alive.